I'd like to commend the Africa Forum and the Network on Debt and Development for bringing us all together to discuss the political economy of Africa's debt, particularly in the context of the ongoing COVID crisis. This pandemic, as you all know, has affected millions across the continent, both directly and indirectly, and cost thousands of lives. It continues to ravage the continent in increasingly virulent waves. The third wave, which is still ongoing, was triggered by the Delta variant, and it peaked at some 380,000 cases a week by mid-July. The bottom line is that the pandemic is costing the African continent billions in lost productivity, millions of jobs have evaporated. The global nature of the pandemic also means that trade in goods and services has been decimated. Millions are now forced to, millions are now being pushed back into extreme poverty. In short, the pandemic is eroding hard-won development gains and putting the continent back at least 2.5 decades. What all of this means is that revenue streams across the continent have taken a serious hit, and African countries are finding it difficult to make the strategic investments they need in infrastructure, technology, and human capital that will allow them to attain the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030 and also the African Union's Agenda 2063 aspirations. Earlier this year, UNDP's Regional Bureau for Africa released a couple of reports. The first one analyzed the long-term socioeconomic impacts of COVID across diverse contexts. We were able to trace some of the challenging impacts that COVID is going to have on African economies and African citizens. But I think the takeaway here is that it's going to take much longer than we anticipate, and the economic impact will be felt for decades. This means that the ability of countries, African countries, to respond and to manage their economic affairs is going to be challenged. A second report on external debt and COVID in Africa explored how African countries are experiencing steep contractions in outputs, and how this in itself is exacerbating, as previous speakers have said, an existing debt stress in many countries. However, it's important to know that the question of debt is an integral part of understanding how economic development is going to unfold. As we know, the continent faces a number of significant funding gaps. For infrastructure, we're looking at something in the region of $170 billion a year. To attain the Sustainable Development Goals, we're looking for investments that amounts to about 9% of GDP. And this has only been made worse by the pandemic. Responses to the pandemic have been varied, and let me focus on a couple that are looking specifically at the debt issues. The Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which is a multi-donor initiative, has provided quite a bit of relief for a number of African countries, but it's not anywhere close to what the African continent needs. We do believe it needs to go deeper, and it also needs to include Africa's 16 middle income countries, because it only focuses on low income countries primarily. If there is to be meaningful fiscal space that will allow countries not only to service debt, but make the strategic investments that they require. We need a lot more focus on how we could deepen and expand initiatives like the DSSI. My colleague also mentioned the fact that the SDR allocations came into effect a couple of days ago. But of the $650 billion worth of added reserves that are potentially created, only 33.6 billion will go to the African continent. There are now discussions of channeling an additional 100 billion from countries that could afford it. But again, we think that this needs a lot more needs to be done. We also need to look at the cost of borrowing. Most African countries pay a lot more in interest rates for their loans and also for bond offerings. And this is a fact, this is caused by a variety of factors, including the fact that the pricing of risk across the African continent by global credit rating agencies has not always reflected some of the African realities in Africa's economic. Debt, we believe, is a development priority, and Africa desperately needs, particularly in the context of COVID, new and creative solutions for sustainable financing and debt management. We need to have countries working together with creditors and credit agencies to rethink how the continent's development could be financed more responsibly and more sustainably. African governments need to, of course, improve public expenditure management and public financial management, but there also needs to be a lot more to be done to address the leakages that have been mentioned, and also to enhance domestic revenue mobilization, because we do believe that the use of Africa's resources for Africa's development should be prioritized. At UNDP, we have worked very closely with over 40 African countries in designing socioeconomic response plans to COVID, which include a focus on natural resource governance. Also includes a focus on understanding how to how to enhance public and financial management in these very difficult times. Our renewed strategic offer in Africa focuses on building forward in ways that are smarter, fairer, and more sustainable. And this includes getting to grips with this thorny issue of debt management. I'd like to once again commend the organizers, and as we leave, as you deliberate on some of the innovations and creativity necessary to address and forestall debt crisis in Africa, let me also leave you with a couple of things to consider. Addressing COVID and its impact across the continent is going to require having vaccines not just available across Africa, but also affordable. And so understanding how to finance a vaccine campaign across the African continent, which is also a global priority, is an important part of this. Second important part of this is natural resource governance. We really do need to twin national resource governance with debt management, because weak governance of the natural resources, not just in terms of issues relating to corruption, but also issues relating to contracting, the two key C's in natural resource governance, are important aspects that need to be emphasized. It's vitally necessary if the continent is to reach its potential and attain the aspirations as articulated in the African Union's Agenda 2063. Over the next 3 days, I'm sure that you're going to have a lot of depth and breadth in this important topic. And we at UNDP will remain tuned because we look forward to learning from you all. Thank you.
To read and sign the Harare Declaration, go to www.afrodat.org/initiatives. Click on Afrodat Conference on Data and Development, and then read more. And finally, the outcome statement.